Welcome to the Legal Leaders Podcast, brought to you by InView, LawView's community for in-house legal professionals, where we dive into the heart of the legal profession to bring you unfiltered discussions with industry titans on a broad spectrum of topics.
Hello and welcome to the Legal Leaders Podcast. I am your host, Emma, and today I am joined by Michael Guilday. Michael is the General Counsel and Head of Property at Sydney Fish Market in Sydney, Australia. And today we're really going to be covering off the ethical problems involved in lawyers not doing strictly legal work as in-house counsel, and what you can do when you're asked to undertake something that you are ethically not sure where it sits or puts you in a compromising position. We're also going to touch on a little bit your experience as a sole legal counsel and how that's been for you. So thank you so much for making the time to chat today. I'd love for you to maybe tell us a little bit more about yourself and your role at the moment.
Thanks very much, Emma. It's great to be with you today, and hopefully I can share some interesting insights for your audience. It's a real privilege to be doing this podcast. So for those who don't know, I'm General Counsel Head of Property, as you said, for Sydney Fish Market. Lots of people ask me, what does that involve? They can't even believe that there's a lawyer at Sydney Fish Market. Many people have been to our site, and so they're familiar with what it looks like. We do have a lot of complex legal issues here, I guess, fortunately for me as a lawyer, because it gives me a lot to do. It's not necessarily a great thing to have so many challenges, but it certainly keeps me busy on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, amazing. And your journey to your current role, was that, I know you've started in private practice and then you made that step in-house. How was that was that something you always planned to do?
No, not at all. I think, whilst my career path is traditional in some senses, I did start in private practice, then I moved in-house. It wasn't by design. I think I always saw myself working as a solicitor in a law firm.
Okay.
And indeed, I did that for around 15 years in all. In retrospect, I don't know how I lasted that long. I think I was probably about, 5 years too many. But what happened is I was fortunate enough to travel with my role overseas and work in London for a few years, and then in Hong Kong for a few years after that as well. And so I guess that broke things up, and they made it, a bit interesting to experience some different ways of working in different countries and different jurisdictions. And that sort of kept me in that role, perhaps, longer than in retrospect, as I said, I wanted to be. And it was only when I returned to Australia about sort of 10 or 12 years ago that the opportunity came up to work in an in-house role. And I sort of thought, oh, look, I've sort of, heard that it's, a good job, but didn't really know that much about it. So I thought I'd give it a try. But what I found is that I really went into it thinking I'd just do the same things more or less that I was always doing as a solicitor in a law firm, but just doing them in a different location, that I was now in a company and not in a law firm. And I hadn't really grasped at that time the totality of the difference in the career paths that I was embarking on, and I guess that's what I've been focusing on for the last 10 or 12 years, is trying to make head or tail of what actually an in-house counsel does.
And I guess that is a bit about why this podcast exists as well, is it's talking to legal leaders like yourself and really, what is it that a legal leader does. And before we get into, I guess, like the meaty part of our conversation today, I'd love to ask, like, in your opinion, what is the most important aspect of being a legal leader?
Oh, wow, great question. I think being a legal leader means just being a leader like any other leader in an organisation. It just so happens that my expertise might lie in the legal field, another person's expertise might lie in marketing or finance or IT or whatever it is. But to be a leader is something that I've had to adapt to and learn over the years. I've not been a natural at it by any stretch, and it's only through persistence and really learning more about myself has been the key to unlocking how I can be a better leader within my organisation.
That's really important too, because I think we focus so much on legal, but like you say, it is just the leader part that is probably the most important. I would love to maybe dive into what we want to talk about today, and that's the ethical challenges that lawyers come across in practice. So can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on the dilemma of lawyers being involved in not strictly legal work in an in-house or private practice sort of arrangement, but maybe more focusing on maybe in-house for now?
Yeah, sure. And I think this is, I was really keen to talk about this topic. It's a favourite of mine, and it's a favourite of mine because I hear it being talked about so often amongst my peers when I get together with fellow in-house counsel. We're always talking about what is the work that we are doing. And it's such a fascinating question because in a sense it ought to be so straightforward, but it just isn't. And I found that from talking to others and also from my own career path, I've worked in around four different in-house environments of all different shapes and sizes, listed companies, not-for-profit, SME type company that I'm in at the moment, and the nature of the work is different depending on the organisation. And whilst that might sound obvious, um, it's of course a lot more nuanced than that. I mean, it's not only is the nature of the work different, but it's things like the risk profile of every organisation is going to be slightly different, and therefore the work of a lawyer within those organisations is is going to be different depending on what the risk appetite is. For example, if an organisation has an extremely low tolerance to contractual risk, then there's going to be a lot of focus on the ins and outs of the contracts that that organisation is entering into. However, if the risk lies elsewhere, then perhaps there isn't going to be as much focus on something like that, and the work is elsewhere. So that's perhaps what I'd like to talk about today, is just exploring that nuance of what is the work that we do as an in-house lawyer.
Yeah, it's like you said, you were really keen to talk about this because it is something that you are speaking about with your peers and colleagues. And so, for you, what is it then what is the work that you are doing as a general counsel in your current role?
Yeah, and I look, it's again a great question because it's not something that I can easily answer. And so the best way, and I have to say for anyone else out there that's had to really think very uh, very carefully about what is the actual work that we're doing, is it aligned with what the organization wants us to do, and all that kind of thing. It's a really hard task. And so, and it's not something that I've got right in the beginning. And so it's really been an evolution and something I'm just trying to get better at doing. So what I try and think about is what is the value that I add as an in-house counsel? What are some of the things that I can do that are perceived to add value to my leader, so the person that I report to, who's the CEO in our organization, but also the other stakeholders within the business and then the broader stakeholders that connect with our business. So what is the value that I add? And so I have to think about, what is the really, what is the reason that I'm here, and what can only I do that others can't do? And the reality is that I do lots of things that actually other people can also do. And that's where the boundaries start to get a little bit fluid. And particularly because I'm in an executive role, I act as an executive as well as the legal leader. And so really I perform functions that the other executives can also perform in leading the business. But when I perform those functions, I, I perform those functions as a lawyer. And so that's fundamentally different to the person next to me who's not a lawyer, because I have certain legal duties in addition to the training that I've had as a lawyer, is different to the training of a non-lawyer, and therefore I add a different perspective. It's not necessarily a better perspective or one that should necessarily prevail, but it's a different perspective nevertheless. And I think what I'm big believer of is that diversity of opinion, particularly at the leadership level, and the ability to sort of ask the difficult questions, ask questions that other people haven't thought of, ask questions about things that might be coming up in the future. They're the kinds of things that will add value to my organization. And so that's what I try and think of in a task kind of way, like how can I add value in terms of my role?
No, I really like that. And you mentioned something there, like obviously as someone as an executive, the general counsel, you have obligations to the company, but you also as a lawyer have obligations in terms of ethical ones. When you were admitted as a lawyer. So how, can you think of maybe an example of where that can come into tension, or where you have been faced with a situation where you're not sure what the right move is make when you're looking at these two different kind of ethical obligations?
Look, it's really hard because I took on a dual role when I
Mm,
came to Sydney Fish Market because there was a gap in terms of who was leading the property function here. And so I'm quite often faced with a situation where I'm essentially wearing those two hats.
yeah.
And of course, we know that it's very difficult to separate the two hats. And when we talk about two hats, but really you wear the two hats at once, it's
Mm,
really just one hat. It's
yeah.
conceptually quite hard to think about because I can't. What I know is that I can't go into a meeting and start to negotiate as if I was head of property in complete disregard of the fact that I'm a lawyer. And so we all know that people use certain tactics. Some of them might not necessarily be regarded as ethical
Mm,
from a strict legal standpoint. And therefore, I can't separate that out in the way that I conduct my dual role as the head of property. So I need to make sure that even if I'm negotiating against someone, that I still, for example, make sure that if it's in a contested situation, that they're represented by a lawyer on the other side, so that I'm not essentially negotiating against a non-lawyer and therefore opening myself up to an argument where I could be perceived as taking an unfair advantage of that situation because they're unrepresented.
yeah, wow. And just even thinking about that, it's got me thinking about, people that have come on this podcast already, and they are again wearing that dual hat of being the GC and head of people. We're seeing it more and more that general counsels or head of legals are taking on these other roles, and it's when you enter that room, even though you might be entering it as the head of property or head of people, you are still a lawyer, and you are
Correct.
still, like you say, you can't actually separate those out. So I guess what would, you've been working this through, you've been going through this yourself. What sort of advice would you give to other in-house counsel that are, undertaking work where they feel like there is a bit of a conflict with their ethical obligations?
Mm. So it comes down to, and I hear this a lot, and it's not. I'm not really saying that I've come up with the right way of doing this. I think everyone's going to have their own
Mm,
way of doing things, and there's no right or wrong answers here. I'm just talking about some things that have been successful for me. But what I do here, and I guess the position that I found myself in, is if I was only looking at what the legal tasks were that I was being asked to perform, or what you might traditionally think of as the legal tasks, I found it really difficult because I was straying into commercial areas as well. And I hear this a lot, and lawyers saying, well, I'm also doing the commercial work. And they go, hey, I like doing the commercial work, but I also don't want to do someone else's job because then I'm just doing their job. And, we all know what that looks like. And so people, and we also are very busy and we're being asked to do more for less.
hmm
So how can I possibly be asked to do my legal job and then also do this commercial kind of function as well, which I'm starting to talk about here, which is different to the legal thing, but also be a lawyer when I'm doing those extra functions. So what I'm talking about is giving the advice on the contract, but also negotiating it or making commercial decisions. That's in its simple sense, but it applies to lots of other things in that people management situation. It might involve giving the advice in relation to a termination of employment, but also then carrying it out.
Mm,
So there's lots of different things, and we all know that's what it looks like. But what I say to myself, and advice I would give if anyone wished to listen to it was that don't be afraid to step into that commercial space, but make sure it's aligned with what the organisation's objectives are for my particular role. And that's why I took on the dual role. It was to make sure that I could get resources to perform that role, that it was recognised internally, that we could allocate separate budget to it. Rather than having to sort of try and struggle and make everything fit within this kind of legal world. And I think that's why we're seeing lots of in-house lawyers taking on dual roles, is because they are being asked to perform things outside of their traditional role. ESG is another great example. I mean, by all means, get involved in ESG, and I do that myself. But do I also want to be the head of ESG? Then that's a separate question, because that requires resources, budget, and people to help get all the important things done in that space. And so I see it as a way of just aligning with the organisation's objectives and structure to make sure that what I do is properly recognised, is supported, has KPIs attached to it, uh, and is remunerated and so forth, in accordance with the functions that I have to perform. And I think that applies to a lot of other different roles, where I see people saying, oh, we've got to stop doing all this kind of commercial work and we've got to just focus on the legal things because we've only got budget to do the legal things. Well, I'm not sure that's the right answer, because I'm not sure the organisation actually wants people to focus only on the legal stuff, but it does involve the really difficult questions of asking, what are we really doing here? What are we really being asked to do? And what are the functions that we can help the organisation better succeed at?
Because it's like you say, right? You're being asked to do more with less, and you want to, I guess, as an in-house counsel, you want to take on these extra responsibilities. You want to get kind of really involved in the business. You want to put your hands up for these extra things, but then how does that work in practice if you're just absorbing it, but there's no recognized position or
Yeah,
title, and it just becomes a bit of I'm doing all of these things, but also I'm not being
I'm not getting
recognized.
recognised. Yeah.
Exactly.
And here's the thing, right? Because in actual fact, I think that whatever we traditionally thought of as legal, and in my world, I've done a lot of work on contracts, so that's typically what I go to for examples. That whole world has changed, because we all know that technology is much better with contracts now than it ever used to be, and including with AI, it can review contracts pretty well. I think it can also kind of negotiate them, I think, a bit as well. Like it's incredible. And so all of these kind of strictly legal tasks, if people are thinking that's my center of excellence, then I think over time that I mean, there is a role, right, for contract specialists and for the technology, and for that to be done in a way that's as efficient and as optimized, to meet the needs of the organization. But in my mind, that's less and less of an actual work of a lawyer than what it used to be. And so it does beg the question of what is the actual work that we ought to be doing if technology is actually taking up all this other process related stuff. I mean, the courts will move this way in the future if they're not moving this way already, with dispute resolution becoming increasingly influenced by technology, that there won't be as much process around that. So this process kind of stuff that a lot of lawyers do a lot of, I don't think that's the work that we want to be doing. Someone needs to do it, but increasingly, we see it in the conveyancing space. That's pretty much all gone electronic. So there's not much for lawyers to do there anymore. And I've even seen in family law situations, a lot of that is pretty formulaic now and is being rolled out by legal practices that in fact employ a lot of non-lawyers to do that work. So what is the work of a lawyer? It's something different to that. It's a much higher order work that I think we ought to focus on, and it's work that we're doing because we're subject to our ethical duties as lawyers, and that will continue to separate us from other people, because other people don't have those roles. They're not particularly. I mean, of course, in a private practice sense, there's insurance and things of that nature that apply to when a lawyer's involved, and that's really important. And we need to recognise that is why people go to external law firms for their reputation and so forth. I don't believe it should be any different in an in-house context. Whilst we don't have our own insurance for the advice that we give, I think the same reasons apply. We go to our in-house counsel because there's a certain reputation risk that's ameliorated. People feel comfortable if they have the lawyers involved. And of course, we hope that we're giving the right advice.
Before we continue, a quick word from our sponsor. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Mark your calendars for June 11th, 2024 because InView's conference, InView Connect, is coming back to London for another year. Whether you're a seasoned in-house legal leader or just starting out your journey in-house, InView Connect has something for everyone. Secure your in-person or virtual spot now at inview.lawview.com and join us for the day to learn, share and connect. We can't wait to see you there. It's so interesting to think about, and I think this is probably why it has been coming up a lot for you. Did you, if you think about it, so you go through law school, you're surrounded by other training lawyers and you are trained to think a certain way, and then you go into legal practice and you're surrounded by people that also think that way. Like, when was it for you that you realized how differently a lawyer is trained to think? Like, was it when you went in-house and you all of a sudden kind of saw like the different process or the different skills that you bring to a negotiation or to an executive?
Yeah, absolutely. It was only when I went in-house, I think, that it really started to open my eyes. And it wasn't. Am a very slow learner. I openly admit that.
I don't know if I believe
it took me a while to get it. And I'd say to everyone, just persevere with learning about what's going on out there. But it did take me a while to really learn what other people were doing. I mean, of course, people and I naturally as well very focused on what I'm doing. But of course, being in an in-house environment, it's all about understanding what other people are doing. What are their strengths and weaknesses, and how can I assist? And that for every organisation is going to look different. Some people might find their relationship needs to be with the finance team, where their finance skills might be really great, but some of the aspects of the accounts or understanding certain aspects of that might involve some legal issues that are commercial as well, then there needs to be a lot of support there. We've talked about the people and the HR context where sometimes there's a need for lawyers to be more involved in helping on that side. In other times there isn't. Other times there's very capable HR people that pretty much run all that stuff independently of their in-house lawyers. And it just depends on the nature of the business, the risk profile they wish to take, and understanding. For me, it's understanding where I can contribute most optimal use of my time.
You've mentioned a little bit around how the more process-driven work is kind of not where lawyers are focusing anymore. That's, we've got technology, there's AI to help with those sorts of things. It's making, lawyers more efficient. How do you balance that need for efficiency with thoroughness and attention to detail? Like, how do you say, look, that's going to be looked after by technology or something else, and I'm going to focus on this? Like, how do you balance that, and where is the involvement still needed in your perspective?
I think, and this is a really interesting one, because again, for me, the answer, again, it comes down to risk. I think what we're seeing across the board is a resetting of everyone's risk profile in relation to, for example, use of technology. In the past, we wouldn't trust certain technology with certain things. Banking, I think, took a little while to come on, but it's obviously extremely pervasive today, but still not without its problems and risks. That's a really good one where we see a lot of scams and things like that. So it's not perfect. Look, I remember when we first started, and I tell this story a lot, when the email first was invented, it wasn't used for a business purpose. The email was used principally for people, talking about personal stuff and what they were doing on the weekends. And it wasn't until, because it wasn't trusted as people were still using the fax, they were still using the letters, and couriers and all that stuff, despite the fact that for years you could use email to send contracts, and now we're getting a much higher degree of trust around that. We're even signing documents electronically. We're even signing deeds electronically. It's moving slowly and slowly. We're doing more and more and more. There's still witnessing kind of things that people are not 100% comfortable with, but we are trusting it a lot more than what we have ever before. I think it doesn't apply any different if you're using an AI tool to review a contract. I use some of that stuff. Quite early on, particularly, I've got sort of background in reviewing leases and things like that in a property context. And there was technology around some years ago that purported to do that. It didn't do it particularly well. So there wasn't a lot of trust around it. I wasn't, I'd still review or have a external lawyer review the document, and we just use it as kind of a backup or on some very lower level things. Now, of course, it's much more sophisticated, and all kinds of contracts can be reviewed by AI. We've got a much higher degree of trust. There will come a point where we're comfortable saying to our business colleagues and rolling that technology out for them, and the lawyer not being involved at all in those processes, until, of course, something goes wrong. And of course it still will. And I'm very confident, um, unfortunately, that things will continue to go wrong in a very substantial way in relation to lots of things in the rollout of this tech. I mean, I think the things that people talk about, the opportunities with AI, of course, the risks that go along with that are substantial. Some people are talking about those as well, but this is where the lawyers will be involved, and I'm confident there's a future for us going forward. People will continue to disagree over things,
Everything.
everything, right? Yeah, that's our nature, and it doesn't matter, what it is. We'll continue to need people to help resolve those things for us.
It's the story you tell about the email. It's funny because I remember when I was at law school, it was like learning about when it was considered to be like delivered, whether when it was when the email was sent or was it when the email was received. And I remember learning about all of that, and that was like quite new stuff at the time. And it's like funny to think, like, I obviously don't practice as a lawyer but now, but it's interesting to think about that and think how far things have come and how things have changed. And it's like, oh, of course there's going to be room for error and things to go wrong in that. Like it's quite, we're even, we're struggling to keep up as humans with all the new things. And I can only imagine as the general counsel as well, you wear a lot of that in terms of where is the risk of all these things that people are wanting to do.
Yeah, and look, I think it's a really interesting evolution, because in a sense, because people have talked, when I was at uni, people said, "Oh, there's more people at law school than there are lawyers, so you're never going to get a job as a lawyer, so don't even think about that." The reality is, of course, there's now a lot more lawyers today than there were then, so they're doing something. Obviously, the growth has changed, and
Mm.
in a sense, I always think about this. I mean, it's generalization, but everything's gone legal, right? I mean, in society, people are much more aware of their rights,
Mm.
and so and that's whether or not lawyers are involved in this, but there's a much bigger awareness of what's right and wrong, and what recourse is available when people aren't getting their way. And this is where lawyers will continue to need to be involved, is helping in these situations. And it goes further than that, because we all know that in lower developed countries, that people's rights aren't as well protected, and there will be, in the future, more focus on issues like that. So the the the, the scope of the task is huge, and I think we haven't yet fully understood all of the different ways that we can help in as lawyers in society.
While we're in this kind of mode of reflection, I'd love to know, is there anything when you look back on your career that you would do differently, and why is that?
Yeah, lots of things. Look, there's no regrets because it's all been a learning experience, and so I'd say that first of all, and I'm only in the position I'm in today because I've learnt to do things and seen how things have gone wrong, and sometimes I've had more of a hand in that than others, and so I've got some experience in what unfortunately good and bad looks like. But as I said, look, I probably wouldn't have persevered so long in private practice. But it seemed really good at the time, and I was traveling and doing all this cool stuff. But I look back on that work and I think, my God, it was a lot of it was very tedious, contractual kind of stuff that really wasn't that helpful probably to anyone. But I spent a lot of my time doing highly technical work. And so today I enjoy doing things that are perhaps not as technical, if I can put it that way, but are actually just as difficult problems to solve.
Yeah, no, that's I guess it's that whole the how much broader your role probably is now that you're in-house. And again, it's that what is it that you do as a lawyer probably was a little bit more like you could probably actually really say what that was when you were in private practice, like you do
That's right.
ABC, and whereas now when you're in-house in the position you're in where you're wearing two hats, like that's where it's become like, what is it actually that as I do as a lawyer, like what value am I adding, right?
Yeah, that's right. And look, I didn't question it for a very long time. It was just people, and I think this is a big change that that I went, didn't particularly like school, liked university, but it was hard. But I was really eager to get in the workforce, and really apply this stuff. But of course, there's a big disappointment when we first get into the workforce because the nature of the work isn't that interesting. Um, and it was like that for quite a while, but I persevered with it. Um, and I just hope that people today, their expectations seem to be a lot different. That yes, we know more at an earlier age, but the way that I think we learn is from experience and applying ourselves in different situations. And yes, it probably won't be the same experience that I had for someone going into the workforce today. They won't hopefully do as much tedious work that I had to do, um, but there will nevertheless need to be that time that people, I think, spend observing what's going on in the world, and not just in their individual office or situation, to actually gain the experience to be successful.
Yeah, I think I really like that because I think as well, it's, you become a lawyer, you're maybe 21, 22, 23 if you've gone straight from university, and you're like, you just don't have that same sort of world and life experience to provide advice like you do when you're further on in your life and you've gone through some hard times and been through some big things. And it's just that all helps build you as a person, to then actually probably make your advice more relevant and, like it just you just
More real.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah, 100%.
And look, that just hasn't changed. That's the constant that hasn't changed. And I think we just have to be aware that just because we can search for an answer on the internet or get a letter to draft something in AI, and I know that the junior lawyers are doing this, and I think, hey, I can review this in 5 minutes, and it doesn't take 5 hours. To really think about, well, that's fine, but where am I adding the value here? And I think that's the bit that's looking different. That that the value that a junior lawyer needs to add today looks different from probably what I had to do 20 odd years ago.
I'd love to touch on your experience as a sole counsel, because we're talking about, the risk and, what is the ethical kind of when you're in an in-house role, that ethical obligation, where does it sit? And you're doing this as a sole legal counsel, and I know there'll be so many other people that listen to this podcast that are in sole legal counsel positions. So that does fall on you as the lawyer for the business. You don't have this team to kind of bounce ideas, kind of go through the nuts and bolts of things. So can you share some insight in what your experience has been in your current role as the sole legal person for the business?
It's a fascinating situation, but not one that, as you say, is very common. And I think we know from the statistics that the majority of in-house lawyers are either sole legal counsel or practicing in teams of 5 or less. And to me, being the sole lawyer, I was also the first internal lawyer in this organisation, which was a real privilege. Um, and and that was great because there were no preconceptions about what my role was going to be, and so that gave me a lot of ability to and scope to educate the business on what I was intending to do. And it wasn't necessarily what they thought that I was going to be doing when I started, but hopefully, nevertheless, they've understood that there's been some value in the things that I have done. And that's the journey that we get that we're privileged to go on as sole in-house counsel, is to is to have that degree of intimacy with the business and closeness to everything it does. Of course, if you're the sole counsel, it's necessarily a senior position in the business, so that's the other great thing about it. But it also can be very isolating. So I've found I've really uprated my participation in networks, and whether it's obviously in things like this with InView, or with other things I do with the Law Society of New South Wales and with the Association of Corporate Counsel, I get a huge amount out of that and try and bring those experiences to bear in the work that I do on a day-to-day basis. But it's for people looking to do it, it's a great opportunity. For me, it looks increasingly like, and I've never practiced as a sole practicing lawyer, as a solicitor in my own firm, but increasingly I look at it that way, or how I perceive that would look like. And that means I have to be as robust as I would be as if the business was approaching me and I was my own little law firm. And that doesn't mean I'm a long way from the business or creating some kind of silo or whatnot, but there has to be a degree of robustness to the way that I operate within the business. And I can only do that because of the help that I get from technology. The technology helps us to, I think, do things on our own a lot more than what it could. And that's why we're seeing, I think, a growth in sole in-house lawyers in companies, because we're perceiving that we can do this on our own with the help of technology. And but at the same time, we need to make it work for us. We need to make sure that, for example, if I leave the organisation, that there's a ability to have succession around my role. And so, where are the records? How do we keep it? How are matters generated? And I'm not talking about a lot of forms or anything like that, but just having some kind of a system so they're actually running things in a way that, from an external perspective, you could look in and say, right, I could tell what Michael's doing here, what work he's been doing, and where the advice has been given. And I think increasingly that's going to be important. As we all know, one of the huge changes with technology is this ability to go back and look at everything that's been done. And that's a huge change to what used to happen. People used to need to get witness statements, things like that. Now it's just, you go to the records, you go to the emails, you go to the text messages, you go to CCTV, you go to all this stuff. But we need to make sure that as lawyers, we've got that kept securely safe and segregated from the rest of the business, to the extent it's sensitive and needs to be protected.
I really like that comparison you've made of, as a sole legal counsel, you operate like a sole practitioner. It is your little business. You need to protect yourself from risk. You need to have a record of everything, and you need to think of it in that way. And yeah, and that was the one thing I was thinking, is that it would be in some ways isolating, especially when it's in a maybe high stress scenario, and people are coming to you with something that is stressful, and it's like you don't have your team around you to. But then, like you say, you build your team with the business. Like you do actually then rely less on your legal team, and actually your team is the executive that you work closely with or other peers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the privilege that I have, is to work as a lawyer, but within a business, and see what that looks like.
Do you have any advice for people that are maybe operating in or considering a sole legal counsel role, or, in one and struggling? What would be your kind of tips for ensuring that you feel protected and kind of engaged in that position?
So, like I said, engage with the networks, right? And engage with other people that are in similar positions and see how they've solved problems. At the end of the day, we're here to solve problems, and I can't do that on my own. And so I make sure that I at least know where to go to find people who might be able to help. And that's pretty much a lot of what my role is not trying to do too much myself. That's kind of been a real mantra of mine, and I do very openly state that to lots of people and say I don't really do what you might regard as the legal work, and that a lot of that is outsourced to law firms, and I have but but I deliver that to the business. So, that doesn't come directly from the law firms or the business, it comes through me. So I guess you can call that shadowing or ghosting, some people call it. um, and not always, because we're involved in some disputes, and obviously the lawyers directly deal with other sides and all that usual stuff. But in terms of the advice I give, for example, to our board, I deliver that advice myself, but it is backed up by a whole team of other people. And so it's how I leverage those resources, both in the legal sense, but also in the commercial sense, and bring that totality of expertise and experience to the benefit of the business, is what's important. So leverage the networks, whether it's other in-house counsel, to work out who to talk to. There's great networks around these days. I use them all the time. I asked a question about board governance recently to one of my networks and got some really good feedback of who to talk to, and that now I'm trying to input that expertise into our business. That's why people employ us, because we have access to those networks and we're able to bring that expertise when it's required to bear to solve problems.
Yeah, it kind of then comes back to, again, like, what is it, what you're saying at the start, like, what is it that what is it that your job is, and what people would perceive as, an in-house lawyer to be doing compared to with what actually you do. So on that, what do you really see happening to your role in the next few years? Like, where do you see some areas that might change a lot, and what do you hope will happen to the kind of day-to-day of your role?
Sure. I mean, I always hope that there'll be less legal stuff to deal with, right? I mean, that's a hope that I have. Unfortunately, that hasn't been the
No.
case to date. But fortunately for me, because I'm still here and I'm still doing lots of stuff. But I hope that as we get better at doing things, we will have less, exposure to certain things. But I hope it's my system is not perfect. It's far from, it's still a work in progress. So it's all about developing that system, making sure that, my records are as good as they can be.
Mm,
And should, anything happen to me, that would be easy for someone else to come in and do the same role that I'm doing. Um, in the future, I just hope to set up, leverage those relationships, set up, optimize them. We've got a really good mix of external law firms we're working with. There's still work to do on that. And that's a key part of my role, is trying to bring the best external expertise to bear to solve problems at the most efficient, pricing and all that type of thing. And of course, we know that that's not easy at times to get that stuff right. So it's getting that mix right,
mm,
getting the system right, optimizing my role. But yeah, it's hopefully less legal, it's more commercial.
mm.
But as I said, I do those commercial tasks as a lawyer. That's the value that I'm adding.
Yeah. No, it's such a good point to make, and I feel like this has been such an interesting conversation, which I'm so excited to share with our community because, like you say, it's very topical at the moment. There's a lot of people taking on these other roles. Maybe they've already been doing them, but they're giving them a name now, and it's just, how does that work in practice? What does it actually mean that you are doing? And I've just loved all your expertise and thoughts on this, Michael. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I will tag your LinkedIn profile in the show notes. So if anyone wants to reach out, pick up the conversation, or just join your network, they can do so.
Thanks, Emma. It's been a real pleasure.
Awesome.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. If you enjoyed listening, please hit follow and leave us a review on your listening platform of choice. We love engaging with our community and hearing from you, so please head to inview.lawview.com. Thank you so much for tuning in.